What's up, guys? Welcome back to another video. Today I'm going to be talking about what made MW2 so great, so let's get into it. Now, it's pretty obvious when someone tells you what their favorite COD game is. A lot of times people are going to tell you either MW2 or Black Ops 2, but a lot of times you hear MW2, and the reason for that is how iconic it is. And, even though the game has some flaws to it, like the whole one-man army noob tube, nonsense that was in the multiplayer, that's pretty minor when you compare to everything else that it had that was literally perfect. Like the campaign. I thought the campaign was fantastic, especially due to the fact that it wasn't afraid to be controversial. You had missions like No Russian that literally got all these boomers' panties up in a knot. Those pussy boys that couldn't handle the roughness and toughness of a mission like that being put into a video game, and it made them cry and say stuff like, oh, that's horrible that you can play as a bad guy in a video game. It's like, well, first of all, if you were too much of a puss to actually play the mission, it gave you an option to skip it. That was like the wimp filter, basically saying if you're too much of a little bitch, you can just skip the mission. But in reality, that mission was in the game to show you how bad of a guy that Makarov was. It set the tone for the story of Makarov, so even if you skip the mission, you're basically like missing out on that part of the story. But of course, they had to put it in there because if it was a mandatory mission to play, I could only imagine how many fucking pussy-ass boomers would have been crying about it, that was actually a mandatory mission. But since it wasn't, they couldn't really freak out as much after they found out the fact that you could just skip it and not even play it. But I never skipped it. I always played it because it's part of the story, and I wanted to see everything that the game had to offer regardless of what it was, because I'm not a wimp. So, and then of course you have to look at the multiplayer. Obviously, MW2 multiplayer is very iconic. You have like basically the introduction, the birth of trick shotting and quick scoping, and just a different style of gameplay that prior to this game was not really seen as much. Obviously, people did somewhat trick shot and quick scope in games like COD 4 and World at War, but it wasn't the same thing as MW2's version of those two things. It's the birth of things like ill cams. You would have never had ill cams without MW2. The multiplayer really changed the COD community forever. It basically started the whole idea of content creation for Call of Duty on a bigger level. Yeah, people were still making content on games like, COD 4, World at War, especially with zombies, that helped a lot. But MW2 is, in my opinion, when the game blew up on the internet and everybody was thinking like, okay, so what is this Call of Duty game? Like, I want to get into this, especially for people that, didn't know that much about it. I had already known about COD long before I knew about Call of Duty YouTubers, because I started with Call of Duty 2. So I had already been playing the game for years before this game came out. But for newer players who weren't very familiar with it, the rise of the MW2 multiplayer and all that popularity brought in a lot of new fans, making the franchise more successful. Those are things that are just basically, undeniable. Can't deny it, because it really did do that. It revolutionized Call of Duty in general. And then you have to look at even smaller things like the class setups, the fact that you could have a perk that let you have 2 attachments on a gun. Without this game, you wouldn't have your modern day gunsmith, where you can put up to 10 attachments on a gun, which I think is a bit excessive. I kind of like the idea of just 2 attachments, because back then attachments didn't necessarily reflect how good you would do in a game. It was still more about your skill. Whereas nowadays in Call of Duty, the attachments do matter, especially when it's attachments that can increase damage or something like that. It really does matter. Like, if you go up against somebody in a modern COD game with a stock weapon that has no attachments, it's going to be a lot harder. Whereas back in the day with games like MW2, if you were a bare bones kind of guy that just liked an iron sight and you didn't really put anything on your guns aside from maybe an extended mag or FMJ, maybe a suppressor, you're still playing the old school way back then, it didn't really affect anything. So that whole idea was, hey, it's a cool feature, but it's not mandatory. You don't have to use it. And then there's other little things, like in this mission here, Christo Redentor, where you have to be careful because there's civilians, so depending on the difficulty that you play, you're only allowed to have so many civilian deaths, which it's actually somewhat hard to avoid them sometimes, because if you blow up a set of barrels, it might accidentally kill them, and you're not looking to do that. Sometimes it happens. If you're playing on a higher difficulty, especially veteran, I think you're only allowed like 2 or 3 civilian deaths, and it's the fact that people are peeking out of corners like crazy on here. And I really like this mission because it somewhat adds a tactical element to Call of Duty that was never really seen before. Like, Call of Duty is an arcade shooter, it's not a tactical game. And it was cool to see certain special ops missions, incorporate a tactical style of gameplay in it. So, anyways, I hope you enjoyed, and I will see you in the next one.